In the dusty archives of a forgotten monastery deep in the Pyrenees, a monk discovered in 1987 a manuscript that would shatter everything we thought we knew about medieval European history. Between its yellowed pages lies hidden the most disturbing story ever told, that of Isolde of Valdemon, a princess who defied every divine and human law imaginable. Because what you're about to hear might forever change how you view history itself. We find ourselves in 1347 in a region that corresponds to modern-day southern Spain. Valdemon was a small but prosperous kingdom, squeezed between Christian lands and the last Muslim strongholds. A strategic territory ruled by King Aldrich I, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. The castle of Valdemon rose from a steep hill, its black towers piercing the clouds like threatening spears. The villagers whispered that this place was cursed, that the very stones thirsted for blood. They weren't wrong. Aldrich had married Eleanor of Navarre to seal a political alliance, but this union concealed far darker designs. The young queen of legendary beauty, with golden hair and emerald green eyes, had no idea she had just entered the lair of a monster. King Aldrich was a tall, imposing man with black hair streaked with silver and steel-gray eyes. But behind this commanding presence lurked a perverse intelligence, nourished by a sick obsession with absolute power. He had studied ancient texts, forgotten prophecies, and a mad idea was germinating in his twisted mind. For Aldrich firmly believed that a kingdom could only achieve perfection if royal blood remained absolutely pure, and in his demented vision, this meant power should be transmitted in the most direct way possible, even if it shattered every taboo of civilization. The king spent countless hours in his private study, surrounded by forbidden books and arcane symbols. He believed he had discovered the ultimate secret of eternal rule, that divinity itself could be achieved through the perfect union of royal bloodlines, not through marriage to foreign nobility, but through something far more radical and horrifying. On October 13th, 1348, during a night of terrible storms, Isolde of Valdemon was born. Secret chronicles report that her arrival was accompanied by disturbing phenomena. The castle dogs howled throughout the night, milk soured in the stables, and a flock of ravens descended upon the courtyard. The midwife, an old woman respected for her wisdom, emerged from the royal chamber with her face deathly pale. King Aldrich received this news with a terrifying smile. For him, these omens weren't evil, but confirmed that his daughter was destined for an exceptional fate. He immediately dismissed the midwife and forced all witnesses to swear silence under penalty of death. Eleanor, exhausted from a difficult birth, couldn't understand why her husband seemed so pleased by these sinister events. She tenderly cradled her daughter, unaware that this innocent creature had already been promised a horrific fate by her father's madness. From the very first days, Aldrich showed an obsessive interest in his daughter. He spent hours gazing at her in her cradle, murmuring incomprehensible words in Latin. The terrified servants reported that he sometimes spoke to the infant as if she were already an adult, discussing grandiose projects and a glorious future. Queen Eleanor began to feel a growing unease. Her maternal instinct whispered that something was wrong, but she couldn't imagine the scope of the perversity brewing in her husband's mind. The castle itself seemed to reflect this growing darkness. Servants noticed that shadows lingered longer in the corridors, that whispers echoed from empty rooms, and that the very air felt heavy with malevolent anticipation. Some claimed they heard Aldrich speaking to invisible presences in his tower study, making pacts with forces better left unnamed. These men, all bound by secret oaths, had the mission of instilling in the young princess a very particular vision of the world and her role in it. Master Corvus, Isolde's principal educator, was a defrocked monk with extensive knowledge but corrupted morals. He taught the little girl that ordinary rules didn't apply to exceptional beings like herself. "You were born to rule, absolutely," he repeated constantly. "The laws of ordinary men cannot constrain you." Isolde's education was carefully orchestrated to develop in her a sense of total superiority and growing indifference toward others' feelings. She learned the history of great conquerors, with emphasis on their most ruthless actions as examples to follow. Master Corvus introduced her to texts that most scholars considered heretical. Ancient treatises on divine kingships, forbidden manuscripts that spoke of rulers who transcended human limitations through acts that defied conventional morality. "Power," he told her, "recognizes no master save itself. Those born to wield it must be prepared to sacrifice everything ordinary people hold sacred." Simultaneously, King Aldrich multiplied private sessions with his daughter. He spoke to her of their special bond, their unique royal blood that must be preserved at any cost. Gradually, he instilled in young Isolde's mind the idea that their father-daughter relationship transcended social conventions. "We are different, my dear Isolde," he would murmur during their walks in the castle's secret gardens. "Our blood is so pure, so noble, that it would be criminal to dilute it with that of inferior lineages. One day you'll understand that our destiny is bound for eternity." These psychological manipulations, repeated over years, shaped Isolde's mind in terrifying ways. At 8, she already displayed disturbing coldness and a troubling ability to manipulate those around her to get what she wanted. But there's something even more chilling we must discuss. The king's manipulation went beyond mere words. He began conducting strange rituals with his daughter, ceremonies he claimed would awaken her divine nature. In the castle's deepest chambers, surrounded by candles and ancient symbols, he would make her recite oaths in languages she didn't understand, binding her to purposes she couldn't yet comprehend. Meanwhile, Queen Eleanor watched with growing alarm as her daughter evolved. She tried to spend time with Isolde, to instill values of compassion and justice, but her efforts constantly clashed with Master Corvus's teachings and her husband's pernicious influence. Eleanor noticed that her daughter sometimes looked at her with a strange, almost calculating expression. When she tried to correct her or teach her kindness, Isolde would respond with sophisticated arguments that left her unsettled. "Mother, why should I lower myself to the level of commoners?" she would ask with an icy smile. The queen gradually understood that her husband was playing a dangerous game with their daughter. She overheard several disturbing conversations between them, allusions to future projects that chilled her to the bone. When she tried to discuss this with Aldrich, he would either rebuke her violently or deflect the conversation. Eleanor's isolation within her own family became increasingly marked. The servants, terrorized by the king, no longer dared confide their concerns to her. She found herself alone, facing a situation completely beyond her control, powerless to protect her daughter from influences she sensed were destructive. One incident marked a decisive turning point in this underground war. During Isolde's 10th birthday, Eleanor organized a celebration in the castle gardens, inviting children of regional nobles. She hoped contact with other children might awaken more normal feelings in her daughter. But the celebration turned into a nightmare. Isolde, irritated by a young count's casual attitude, coldly ordered the guards to publicly whip him. When Eleanor intervened to protect the child, Isolde fixed her with pure hatred and declared before all the guests, "Mother, you forget your place. I am the heir princess, and no one may contest my decisions." That day, Eleanor realized with horror that her daughter had become a monster, and that this monster now considered her own mother an obstacle to be eliminated. The final confrontation came when Eleanor discovered her husband's true plans hidden away in his study. She found documents outlining a ceremony that would unite the divine bloodlines through marriage between father and daughter. The ritualistic language couldn't disguise the horrific reality of what Aldrich intended. The confrontation between mother and daughter reached its climax when Isolde turned 15. The young princess had developed striking beauty, inheriting her mother's golden hair, but with her father's dark, piercing eyes. This physical beauty contrasted horrifyingly with the coldness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Eleanor, now fully aware of her husband's monstrous plans, made a desperate decision. She would expose the truth to the nobles of the realm, rally them against this madness before it could be consummated. She began secretly meeting with trusted advisors, gathering evidence of Aldrich's heretical intentions. But Isolde had inherited more than her father's looks. She possessed his cunning and his complete lack of moral restraint. She had been monitoring her mother's activities through a network of spies cultivated since childhood. When she learned of Eleanor's plans, she felt no anger, no sadness, only cold calculation. The confrontation came during a family dinner in the Great Hall. Eleanor, believing she had gathered enough support, finally spoke openly. "Aldrich, this madness must end. I will not allow you to corrupt our daughter further with your perverted schemes." Isolde watched this exchange with the detached interest of a predator studying prey. When her mother turned to her, pleading, "Isolde, Mother Isolde," said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence of the hall. "You speak of corruption, yet you're the one who fails to understand divine will. Father has shown me truths you're too weak to comprehend." Eleanor felt her world crumble as she realized the extent of her daughter's transformation. But worse was yet to come. That very night, as Eleanor lay sleeping, she was awakened by a strange sound. In the darkness of her chamber, she could make out a figure standing by her bed. As her eyes adjusted, she gasped in recognition. It was Isolde, holding something that gleamed in the moonlight. "I'm sorry, Mother," Isolde whispered, though her voice carried no trace of remorse. "But you've become an impediment to destiny itself." The official cause of Queen Eleanor's death was declared to be a sudden illness that struck in the night. Only 3 people knew the truth: King Aldrich, who had orchestrated the plan; Isolde, who had carried it out; and Master Corvus, who had provided the untraceable poison that left no evidence behind. At Eleanor's funeral, Isolde wept convincingly, playing the grieving daughter to perfection. But those who looked closely might have noticed that her tears fell only when others were watching, and that, beneath her mourning veil, her eyes held a satisfaction that was anything but filial. With Eleanor's death, the last obstacle to Aldrich's mad design had been removed. The king wasted no time in advancing his horrific plan. He began spreading rumors that Princess Isolde had received a divine vision, a command from heaven itself that would ensure the kingdom's eternal prosperity. The nobility, already cowed by years of Aldrich's increasingly tyrannical rule, dared not question too closely when the king announced that ancient prophecies demanded a sacred union to preserve the royal bloodline. The ceremonies would be conducted according to ancient rites that supposedly predated Christian customs. Master Corvus, now elevated to the position of royal chaplain, crafted elaborate theological justifications for what was to come. He spoke of biblical precedents, of divine commandments that transcended human understanding. Those few scholars, brave enough to question his interpretations, found themselves facing charges of heresy. Isolde herself seemed to embrace her fate with an enthusiasm that disturbed even the most hardened courtiers. She spoke eloquently of her duty to preserve the sacred bloodline, of sacrifices necessary for the greater good of the realm. Her words carried a conviction that was either deeply genuine or masterfully feigned. The wedding ceremony took place on the winter solstice in the castle's ancient chapel, decorated with symbols that predated Christianity. The ritual itself was conducted in Latin, so archaic that few present understood its true meaning. Isolde, now 16, walked down the aisle wearing a crown that had supposedly belonged to ancient goddess queens. King Aldrich, dressed in robes that seemed more suited to a pagan priest than a Christian monarch, waited at the altar with an expression of triumphant satisfaction. When the ceremony reached its climax, when Isolde spoke her vows to become her father's wife, a collective shudder ran through the assembled witnesses. Some later claimed they heard thunder at the moment the union was declared complete, though the sky had been clear. Others spoke of shadows that seemed to dance independently of their sources, of whispers in languages no living person should know. That night, as the castle celebrated what they had been told was a sacred union blessed by heaven, many of the servants crossed themselves and prayed to saints they hoped were still listening. For they sensed that something fundamental had been violated, that their kingdom had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The months following the unholy marriage revealed the true extent of the corruption that had taken root in Valdemon. Isolde, now queen and daughter-wife, wielded power with a cruelty that surpassed even her father's excesses. The court became a place where fear ruled absolutely, where nobles lived in constant terror of displeasing their new sovereign. Isolde's first act as queen was to establish what she called the Court of Divine Justice, a tribunal that answered only to her will. This court had the power to try anyone for crimes against the royal bloodline, a charge so vaguely defined that virtually any action could be construed as treasonous. The young queen princess demonstrated a particular talent for psychological torment. She would invite nobles to elaborate feasts, only to have them arrested mid-meal for imagined slights. She developed a game of forcing courtiers to compete for her favor through increasingly degrading tasks, rewarding the winners with temporary safety, and condemning the losers to fates that served as warnings to others. Lord Matthias de Castilla, once one of Eleanor's most trusted advisors, learned this lesson horrifically when he dared to suggest that the kingdom might benefit from more traditional diplomatic relations with neighboring realms. Isolde had him brought before the Court of Divine Justice on charges of diluting royal purpose with common wisdom. His punishment was designed to send a message. He was forced to watch as his own family was stripped of their lands and titles, then exiled to wander as beggars. But Isolde's cruelty didn't end there. She commanded that he remain at court to serve as her fool, dressed in motley and forced to entertain guests with songs mocking his own former dignity. The kingdom's economy began to crumble under the weight of Isolde's increasingly erratic demands. She commissioned massive construction projects with no practical purpose, declaring them necessary for manifesting divine glory. Entire villages were razed to provide materials for monuments to her own magnificence. But perhaps most disturbing were the rituals that began taking place in the castle's deepest chambers. Rumors spread of midnight ceremonies involving human sacrifice, of attempts to commune with powers that should have remained undisturbed. The very stones of the castle seemed to absorb the darkness of these acts, and many claimed the building itself had become malevolent. King Aldric, meanwhile, seemed to have achieved his goal of absolute power, but the victory had a hollow quality. Increasingly, he appeared to be little more than a figurehead, with Isolde making all significant decisions. Some wondered if the student had surpassed the master, if the monster he had created had grown beyond his control. Not everyone in Valdemon accepted this reign of terror passively. An underground resistance began to form, led by nobles who had managed to escape Isolde's initial purges and commoners who had lost everything to her caprice. Sir Rodrigo de la Vega, a knight who had served Eleanor faithfully, became the unofficial leader of this resistance. He had fled the kingdom after witnessing Eleanor's murder, for he had seen Isolde leaving his queen's chambers that fatal night. Now he worked from the shadows, gathering evidence of the royal family's crimes and building a network of those willing to act. The resistance faced enormous challenges. Isolde had created an extensive spy network, recruiting informants from every level of society through a combination of bribes, threats, and psychological manipulation. Trust became a luxury few could afford, as neighbor turned against neighbor in the paranoid atmosphere that pervaded the kingdom. Messages had to be passed through coded songs sung by traveling minstrels, hidden in the patterns of tapestries woven by seemingly loyal craftswomen, or whispered in confessionals by priests who still remembered their true calling. The resistance learned to communicate through silence as much as words, reading meaning in glances and gestures that could pass unnoticed by Isolde's watchers. One of their most valuable allies proved to be Brother Thomas, a monk who had worked in the castle's library before the current madness began. He had secretly copied many of the documents from Aldric's private study, including detailed accounts of the king's long-term plans and evidence of Eleanor's murder. But the resistance's greatest asset was also their greatest vulnerability: the growing number of people who had been personally wronged by Isolde's regime, families destroyed by her whims, communities devastated by her projects, individuals broken by her psychological games. All were potential allies, but also potential security risks if captured and tortured for information. The resistance began with small acts of sabotage. Supplies meant for the castle mysteriously disappearing, construction projects suffering strange accidents, information about court activities somehow reaching Valdemon's enemies abroad. But as their confidence grew, so did the boldness of their actions. Their most audacious operation involved infiltrating one of Isolde's midnight rituals. Brother Thomas, disguised as a visiting scholar, managed to witness and document a ceremony that provided horrifying confirmation of the rumors that had been circulating. What Brother Thomas witnessed in the castle's depths that night surpassed even the resistance's darkest suspicions. The ritual chamber, carved from living rock far beneath the castle's foundations, was decorated with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. Ancient texts, written in scripts that predated any known language, lined the walls. At the center of the chamber stood an altar stained with substances that Brother Thomas preferred not to identify. Isolde, dressed in robes that seemed to be cut from shadow itself, presided over a ceremony that involved participants he recognized as missing nobles and merchants, people who had supposedly left the kingdom of their own accord. But it was the purpose of these rituals that truly shocked him. Through careful observation and eavesdropping, Brother Thomas learned that Isolde's ultimate goal went far beyond mere political power. She believed that through these dark ceremonies, she could achieve actual immortality and godlike abilities. The ancient texts she studied spoke of rulers who had transcended human limitations through the systematic violation of natural law. Each taboo broken, each sacred boundary crossed, supposedly brought her closer to divine transformation. The marriage to her father had been merely the first step in a progression that would ultimately require far greater sacrifices. Brother Thomas discovered journals in which Isolde had recorded her progress toward this goal. She wrote with clinical detachment about the effects of various atrocities on her own consciousness, documenting changes in her perceptions and abilities that she interpreted as signs of approaching divinity. Most disturbing of all, he learned that she planned to extend her quest for immortality to include reshaping the entire kingdom according to her vision. The population would be divided into those deemed worthy of preservation as eternal servants, and those to be sacrificed in grand rituals designed to complete her transformation. These revelations provided the resistance with both the motivation and the knowledge they needed to act decisively. But they also revealed the true scope of the horror they faced. Isolde wasn't simply a cruel tyrant. She was attempting to become something inhuman, and she was willing to destroy everyone and everything in Valdemon to achieve that goal. The evidence Brother Thomas gathered was smuggled out of the kingdom and shared with neighboring realms, some of whom had already been disturbed by refugees' reports of conditions in Valdemon. What had begun as an eternal resistance movement was about to become an international intervention. As winter gave way to spring in Valdemon's third year under Isolde's rule, the kingdom began to show signs of systemic collapse. The queen's increasingly erratic behavior had created a court where paranoia and terror reigned supreme, but it had also made her vulnerable in ways she didn't recognize. Isolde's latest obsession involved the construction of a massive tower that would supposedly serve as a conduit for divine energy. The project required resources the kingdom no longer possessed, and labor from a population already stretched to breaking point. Villages throughout the realm were abandoned as entire families fled rather than be conscripted for construction duties. The economic crisis was compounded by Isolde's decision to debase the currency, melting down gold and silver to create ritualistic objects for her ceremonies. Trade with neighboring kingdoms ground to a halt as Valdemon's money became worthless and its reputation for honoring agreements disappeared. But perhaps most critically, Isolde's psychological manipulation tactics were beginning to fail. The constant atmosphere of terror had initially cowed the population into submission, but prolonged exposure to her cruelty was now generating a desperate courage among those who had nothing left to lose. The resistance, meanwhile, had grown from a handful of survivors into a well-organized movement with support throughout the kingdom and beyond. Sir Rodrigo had managed to establish contact with King Ferdinand of Aragon, who viewed Valdemon's situation as both a humanitarian crisis and a strategic opportunity. The turning point came when Isolde made a critical error in judgment. Convinced of her own invincibility and desperate to demonstrate her divine transformation to potential followers, she announced a grand public ceremony that would supposedly prove her godlike status to all observers. The ritual was to take place in the castle's main courtyard, with attendance mandatory for all nobles and commoners within the kingdom. Isolde proclaimed that those who witnessed her transformation would be granted eternal life as her servants, while any who showed doubt or fear would be consumed in divine fire. This announcement provided the resistance with the opportunity they had been waiting for. For the first time since taking power, Isolde would be vulnerable in a public setting, surrounded by people who had every reason to want her dead. The challenge would be acting decisively while avoiding the massacre of innocents that Isolde would certainly order if she sensed any threat. The day of reckoning arrived on the summer solstice. The castle's courtyard filled with hundreds of people, from great nobles to humble farmers, all gathered under duress to witness what their queen promised would be her ultimate triumph. The atmosphere was thick with tension, fear, and barely suppressed desperation. Isolde appeared at the top of the castle's main tower as the sun reached its zenith. She was dressed in robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and wore a crown crafted from metals and stones that hurt to look at directly. Even from a distance, those in the crowd could sense an aura of wrongness emanating from her presence. The ceremony began with proclamations in that ancient language Master Corvus had taught her, words that seemed to make the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. Isolated on her tower, Isolde began a ritual dance around an altar constructed from black stone, her movements becoming increasingly frenzied as the ceremony progressed. What happened next would be debated by survivors for the rest of their lives. Some claimed they saw Isolde's form begin to change, growing larger and more terrible as shadows gathered around her like living things. Others insisted it was all illusion and stagecraft, designed to terrify observers into submission. But there was no disagreement about what Sir Rodrigo and his fellow conspirators accomplished in that moment of distraction. While all eyes were fixed on the tower, the resistance struck simultaneously at multiple targets throughout the castle. Guards loyal to Isolde found themselves overwhelmed by attackers who seemed to emerge from the crowd itself. The carefully planned assault reached its climax when Brother Thomas, disguised as one of Master Corvus's acolytes, managed to reach the ritual chamber beneath the castle. Using knowledge gained from his previous infiltration, he systematically destroyed the ancient texts and artifacts that Isolde relied upon for her dark ceremonies. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Whatever power Isolde had been drawing upon suddenly vanished, leaving her stranded on the tower as her supporters found themselves facing a populace that had finally overcome its fear. The shadows that had gathered around her dissipated like smoke, revealing her as nothing more than a cruel young woman in elaborate costume. King Aldrich, who had been watching the ceremony from the castle's battlements, seemed to age decades in moments as he realized the scope of his failure. The monster he had created to serve his ambitions had grown beyond his control, and now both were facing the consequences of their crimes. The siege of the castle lasted 3 days. Isolde and her remaining loyalists barricaded themselves in the tower. But without her supernatural advantages, they were simply human beings facing the wrath of an entire kingdom they had tormented for years. When the tower finally fell, the scene that greeted the victors was one that would haunt their memories forever. Isolde was found in the highest chamber, surrounded by the corpses of her most devoted followers, including Master Corvus, who appeared to have taken his own life rather than face capture. But Isolde herself was still alive, though transformed in ways that had nothing to do with the divine ascension she had sought. The young woman who had once been beautiful beyond description was now gaunt and hollow-eyed. Her golden hair turned white as snow. She sat motionless on her throne, staring at something only she could see. When Sir Rodrigo approached to place her under arrest, she showed no recognition of his presence. She spoke continuously in whispers, but the words were in languages no scholar could identify, and they carried an undertone that made listeners deeply uncomfortable. King Aldrich was found in his study, dead by his own hand. A note left behind expressed no remorse for his actions, only bitter disappointment that his grand design had failed to achieve the immortality he had sought. His final words were a warning that others would follow in his footsteps, that the knowledge he had uncovered could never be fully suppressed. The question of what to do with Isolde posed a dilemma for her captors. Traditional justice demanded her execution for the murders of her mother and countless others, but her current state raised questions about her mental competency. Some argued that her condition was itself a form of divine punishment, that she was already suffering a fate worse than death. Brother Thomas, now revealed as one of the resistance leaders, advocated for a different approach. He argued that Isolde should be confined in a monastery, where scholars could study her condition and ensure that the knowledge she possessed died with her. There were too many unanswered questions about the true nature of her transformation and the sources of power she had tapped into. The decision was ultimately made to wall her up in a cell beneath the monastery, where Brother Thomas served, with only a small opening for food and water. She would spend whatever remained of her life in isolation, cut off from the world she had tried to remake in her own image. But even this solution carried risks. Guards reported that strange sounds sometimes emanated from her cell, whispers that seemed to come from multiple voices, scraping noises that suggested impossible movement within the confined space. Some claimed that the very stones around her prison began to show signs of corruption, developing stains and cracks that defied explanation. Years passed, and the kingdom of Valdemon slowly began to heal from the wounds inflicted during Isolde's reign. Sir Rodrigo was acclaimed as the new king, chosen by popular acclaim rather than hereditary right. He proved to be a just and capable ruler, working tirelessly to rebuild what had been destroyed and restore his people's faith in governance. But the legacy of the dark years could not be entirely erased. The castle where Isolde had ruled was abandoned, as no one could be convinced to live within its cursed walls. Travelers reported strange phenomena around the ruins: unexplained lights, voices carried on the wind, shadows that moved independently of any source. The resistance's victory had come at a terrible cost. Many of those who had fought against Isolde found themselves haunted by what they had witnessed and participated in. Some, like Brother Thomas, dedicated their remaining years to documenting the events and ensuring that future generations would be warned against similar temptations. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports that began to filter in from other kingdoms. Stories of nobles who spoke of purifying royal bloodlines, of scholars who sought out forbidden texts, of rulers who believed they could transcend human limitations through systematic violation of natural law. The knowledge that Isolde had pursued had not died with her reign. Like a poison seeping through underground channels, it continued to spread, finding new hosts in every generation. The monastery, where she was confined, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking power at any cost, though few who made the journey ever returned home. Brother Thomas spent his final years writing detailed accounts of everything he had witnessed, creating a record that would serve as both historical document and warning. His last entry, written just days before his death, contained a chilling observation. Evil of this magnitude does not simply disappear. It waits, patient and persistent, for the next opportunity to emerge. We have won a battle, but the war against darkness is eternal. The monk who discovered these documents in 1987 faced a terrible dilemma. Should such knowledge be preserved for scholars and historians, or destroyed to prevent it from inspiring new atrocities? The debate continues among those few who know of the manuscript's existence. Some argue that understanding the mechanisms of evil is essential for recognizing and combating it. Others contend that certain knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, that the risk of inspiring copycat crimes outweighs any academic benefit. What cannot be debated is the power of Isolde's story to disturb and fascinate in equal measure. Here was a woman who chose to embrace the darkest possibilities of human nature, who systematically destroyed everything sacred in pursuit of impossible goals. Her tale serves as a stark reminder that the capacity for evil exists within every human heart, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The kingdom of Valdemon eventually faded from maps and memory, absorbed into larger realms and relegated to footnotes in historical texts. But for those who know where to look, traces of its existence can still be found in place names that locals avoid speaking, in ruins that animals instinctively shun, in bloodlines that carry genetic markers of ancient trauma, and sometimes, on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries whispers from forgotten places, sensitive individuals report hearing a voice that might once have belonged to a princess who traded her humanity for the promise of power. A voice that still calls out from beyond mortal comprehension, seeking new students for lessons that should never be learned. The story of Isolde of Valdemon reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is far thinner than we like to believe. It takes only one person willing to cross certain boundaries, to violate certain taboos, to unleash forces that can corrupt everything they touch. And once such forces are unleashed, they become extraordinarily difficult to contain. Perhaps that's why this manuscript remained hidden for so long, tucked away in a monastery library where few would think to look. Some knowledge is too dangerous for casual consumption, too potent in its potential for inspiration among those already inclined toward darkness. But there's also value in understanding how such horrors come to pass, in recognizing the warning signs that might allow future tragedies to be prevented. Isolde didn't become a monster overnight. She was shaped by years of manipulation, isolation, and exposure to corrupting influences. Her story shows us how psychological warfare can be more effective than physical force in breaking down human resistance to evil. The question that haunts all who study this tale is whether Isolde was truly evil from the beginning, or whether she was created by the circumstances that surrounded her. Could a different environment have produced a different outcome? Or was there something fundamental in her nature that made her susceptible to corruption? These questions have no easy answers, but they're worth pondering as we consider the forces that shape human character and the choices that define our individual destinies. For in the end, we all face moments when we must choose between light and darkness, between the easy path of selfishness and the harder road of service to others. The story of Princess Isolde of Valdemon serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when those choices consistently favor darkness. It reminds us that evil, once embraced, has a momentum of its own, leading inevitably toward destruction, not only of its victims, but ultimately of those who practice it. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that no matter how powerful evil may seem, it contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Isolde's quest for absolute power ultimately left her isolated and powerless, trapped in a hell of her own making. Her father's grand design collapsed because it was built on foundations of cruelty and deception that could not sustain themselves indefinitely. The resistance that finally brought down their reign succeeded not through superior force or cunning, but through their commitment to values that evil cannot understand or effectively counter. Loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage that comes from fighting for something greater than oneself. In our own time, when the temptations of power and the appeal of easy answers to complex problems continue to seduce individuals and nations alike, the story of Valdemon offers both warning and hope. Warning about how quickly civilization can collapse when fundamental boundaries are crossed, but hope that human goodness, even when driven underground, retains the power to eventually triumph over evil. The manuscript ends with these words from Brother Thomas: "Let those who read this account remember that we are all capable of great good and great evil. The choice between them is made not in grand moments of decision, but in the small, daily choices that shape our character over time. Choose wisely, for the consequences extend far beyond ourselves to touch all whose lives intersect with our own." And so ends the tale of the princess who married her father and ordered her mother's death. A story that reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not those born of supernatural forces, but those that emerge from the darkest corners of the human heart. The monk who first discovered this manuscript in 1987, Brother Antonio Valdez, spent the remaining years of his life wrestling with the decision of what to do with this forbidden knowledge. His private journals, discovered after his death in 2003, revealed the psychological toll that studying Isolde's story took on him. "I find myself checking locks twice, avoiding mirrors in dark rooms, and waking in the night with the sensation that someone is watching me," he wrote in one entry. "The rational part of my mind knows these are just psychological responses to disturbing content. But knowing this doesn't make the feelings any less real." Brother Antonio ultimately decided to seal the manuscript away again, but not before making several copies and distributing them to carefully selected scholars around the world. His reasoning was that if such evil could emerge once, it could emerge again, and future generations needed to be prepared to recognize the warning signs. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a historian at Oxford University, who received one of these copies, has spent the last 2 decades researching the historical context of the Valdemon manuscript. Her work has uncovered disturbing parallels between Isolde's story and documented cases of rulers throughout history who displayed similar patterns of psychological manipulation and boundary violation. What makes this manuscript so valuable, Dr. Thornfield explains, is not whether the specific events actually happened, but how accurately it depicts the psychological mechanisms that allow evil to flourish, whether this is history or allegory. It serves as an almost perfect case study in how corruption spreads through institutions and individuals. Her research has identified what she calls the Valdemon pattern, a recognizable sequence of behaviors that appears in various forms throughout recorded history. It begins with isolation of potential victims from support systems, progresses through systematic boundary violation, and culminates in the complete dehumanization of targets. The terrifying thing, she notes, is how often we see elements of this pattern in contemporary politics, business, and even personal relationships. The scale may be different, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Despite official records showing no kingdom called Valdemon in medieval Spain, Dr. Thornfield's investigation has uncovered intriguing archaeological evidence that suggests the manuscript may be based on actual events. Excavations in a remote valley in the Pyrenees have revealed the foundations of a substantial fortress that carbon dating places in the mid-14th century. More disturbing are the human remains found in the structure's lower levels. Forensic analysis indicates that many of these individuals died violent deaths, and several show evidence of ritualistic mutilation consistent with the ceremonies described in the manuscript. Local folklore in the region includes persistent stories about a cursed princess who brought darkness to the land. Though these tales have been dismissed by mainstream historians as typical medieval superstition, the discovery of the archaeological site has forced a reconsideration of these traditions. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from the excavation team itself. 3 separate archaeologists have independently described experiencing nightmares and psychological disturbances after working at the site. 2 members of the team have requested transfers to other projects, citing unspecified personal reasons. Dr. Thornfield herself acknowledges that her research has taken an unexpected psychological toll. There's something about this material that gets under your skin, she admits, even approaching it from a purely academic perspective. I find myself affected in ways that other historical research has never impacted me. The influence of the Valdemon manuscript extends beyond academic circles. Several criminal profilers have found it useful in understanding the psychology of individuals who commit systematic abuse within family structures. The progression of Isolde's psychological development mirrors patterns observed in documented cases of intergenerational trauma and abuse. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who has consulted on several high-profile cases involving family-based criminal enterprises, uses the manuscript as a teaching tool in her courses. It provides an almost textbook example of how pathological family dynamics can escalate into extreme criminality, she explains. The fictional nature actually makes it more useful in some ways, because we can examine the patterns without getting distracted by the specific details of real cases. However, the manuscript has also attracted attention from less benign sources. Internet forums dedicated to alternative history and hidden knowledge have seized upon the story as evidence of suppressed truths about the nature of power and human potential. Some of these discussions take disturbing turns, with participants expressing admiration for Isolde's willingness to transcend conventional morality. Law enforcement agencies in several countries have noted correlations between certain online communities discussing the Valdemon manuscript and individuals later involved in domestic violence or cult-related activities. While no direct causal relationship has been established, the pattern is concerning enough to warrant continued monitoring. The problem with documents like this, explains Detective Inspector James Morrison of Scotland Yard's Specialised Crimes Unit, is that they can serve as inspiration for individuals who are already predisposed toward harmful behavior. They provide a framework for justifying actions that most people would find abhorrent. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a specialist in abnormal psychology who has studied the manuscript extensively, offers a clinical perspective on Isolde's character development. What we see in this story is a textbook case of how systematic psychological abuse can shape an individual's entire worldview, she explains. Isolde didn't start as a monster. She was systematically created to become one. According to Dr. Reeves, the key factors in Isolde's transformation include early isolation from normal social development, which prevented her from learning healthy interpersonal boundaries, constant reinforcement of the idea that she was fundamentally different from and superior to other people, gradual exposure to increasingly extreme ideas and behaviors, each step seeming logical when viewed in the context of what came before. The truly frightening aspect, Dr. Reeves notes, is how methodical and predictable the process becomes once you understand the underlying principles. This isn't about sudden snaps or moments of temporary insanity. It's about the systematic erosion of moral constraints over an extended period. Her analysis suggests that Isolde's story serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority within family structures and the importance of external oversight in child development. No individual should have absolute control over another person's psychological development, she argues. When that happens, the potential for catastrophic outcomes becomes very real. The debate over whether the Valdemon manuscript represents historical fact or elaborate fiction continues to divide scholars. Dr. Michael Patterson, a historian at Cambridge University, argues forcefully that the document is a modern creation designed to look ancient. The psychological sophistication of the character analysis is inconsistent with medieval understanding of human behavior, he contends. This reads more like a 20th century psychological thriller than a 14th century chronicle. I suspect we're dealing with an elaborate literary hoax. However, Dr. Thornfield disputes this interpretation. The archaeological evidence cannot be explained away so easily, she responds. Something happened in that valley, something that left physical traces consistent with the events described in the manuscript. Whether the document itself is contemporary with those events, or a later reconstruction based on oral tradition, is a separate question. The linguistic analysis of the manuscript has provided few definitive answers. The Latin used is archaic, but not impossibly so for a modern scholar to reproduce. Carbon dating of the parchment and ink suggests medieval origin, but these tests are not foolproof and can be manipulated by sufficiently sophisticated forgers. Perhaps more relevant than the question of historical authenticity is the story's psychological authenticity. Whether Isolde of Valdemon actually existed or not, the patterns of behavior described in her story correspond closely to documented cases of extreme abuse and manipulation throughout history. In some ways, observes Dr. Chen, it doesn't matter whether this specific story is true. What matters is that it accurately describes psychological and social dynamics that are demonstrably real and continue to cause harm in the contemporary world. The most disturbing aspect of the Valdemon manuscript may be how relevant its themes remain in the modern era. Dr. Thornfield, S. research has identified numerous historical and contemporary examples of leaders who displayed elements of the pattern exemplified by King Eldric and Princess Isolde. The specific methods change with technology and cultural context, she explains, but the underlying drive for absolute control and the willingness to violate fundamental boundaries remain constant. We see it in political dictatorships, religious cults, criminal organizations, and dysfunctional families around the world. Recent cases of intergenerational abuse within wealthy and powerful families have shown remarkable similarities to the dynamics described in the manuscript. The isolation of victims from outside support, the gradual normalization of extreme behavior, and the use of psychological manipulation to maintain control are tactics that appear again and again in contemporary criminal cases. Social media and modern technology have actually made some aspects of this type of manipulation easier to implement. The ability to monitor communications, control access to information, and maintain surveillance of targets has expanded dramatically since the medieval period. What Eldric accomplished through physical isolation and limited social contact, notes Dr. Chen, modern abusers can achieve through digital means while their victims remain physically present in society. The isolation becomes psychological rather than physical, but it can be just as effective. Perhaps the most sobering lesson from the Valdemon manuscript is how the corruption of a single family ultimately affected an entire kingdom. The story illustrates how evil, once established in positions of power, tends to spread outward like ripples in a pond, touching lives far removed from its original source. The villagers who were conscripted for Isolde's construction projects, the merchant Isolde's, were destroyed by her economic policies. The children who grew up in an atmosphere of terror, all of these people suffered consequences for decisions they had no part in making, observes Dr. Reeves. This dynamic remains relevant in contemporary discussions about institutional responsibility and collective trauma. Communities that experience systematic abuse from authority figures often require generations to fully heal from the damage inflicted. The manuscript also illustrates how resistance to such corruption tends to emerge gradually as people slowly overcome their fear and begin to recognize that collective action is possible. The resistance movement that ultimately brought down Isolde's regime succeeded not through superior force, but through patient organization and moral clarity about what they were fighting against. There's an important lesson here about the power of ordinary people to resist extraordinary evil, notes Dr. Thornfield. But it also shows how much courage and sacrifice such resistance requires, and how long it can take for that resistance to become effective. The continued study and dissemination of the Valdemon manuscript raises important ethical questions about the responsibilities of scholars and institutions when dealing with potentially harmful content. Several universities have implemented special protocols for researchers working with the document, including mandatory psychological evaluations and counseling support. We have to balance the legitimate academic and social value of understanding these patterns against the risk of providing a roadmap for individuals with malicious intent, explains Dr. Patterson, despite his skepticism about the manuscript's authenticity. Even if this is fiction, it's fiction that could inspire very real harm. Some scholars have proposed that access to the complete manuscript should be restricted to qualified researchers, with only sanitized excerpts made available for general study. Others argue that such restrictions amount to censorship and could set dangerous precedents for academic freedom. Brother Antonio's original decision to make copies and distribute them to selected scholars has been both praised and criticized. Supporters argue that his approach struck the right balance between preservation and protection, while critics contend that any distribution increased the risk of the information falling into the wrong hands. The debate has intensified as digital technology makes it increasingly difficult to control the spread of information. Several unauthorized copies of the manuscript have appeared on file-sharing networks, often accompanied by commentary that seems designed to glorify rather than analyze Isolde's actions. Once information like this enters the digital ecosystem, it becomes virtually impossible to contain, observes cybersecurity expert Dr. Rachel Torres. We have to assume that anyone who wants access to this material can obtain it, and focus our efforts on contextualizing it properly rather than trying to suppress it. The search for meaning. Ultimately, the value of the Valdemon manuscript may lie not in its historical accuracy, but in its capacity to provoke important conversations about the nature of evil and the conditions that allow it to flourish. Whether ancient chronicle or modern allegory, it serves as a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity for both great good and great evil. Stories like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our societies, observes Dr. Reeves. They ask us to consider how we would respond if faced with similar situations, and what safeguards we need to prevent such horrors from occurring. The manuscript also highlights the importance of individual choices in shaping collective outcomes. Each character in the story, from King Aldrich to Master Corvus to the servants who enabled their crimes, made decisions that contributed to the ultimate tragedy. Their example reminds us that evil rarely succeeds without the passive compliance of many ordinary people. Conversely, the resistance movement that eventually triumphed shows how individual acts of courage can accumulate into powerful forces for positive change. Brother Thomas's documentation, Sir Rodrigo's leadership, and the countless unnamed individuals who chose to resist despite personal risk all played essential roles in the eventual victory of good over evil. The story doesn't present heroism as superhuman achievement, notes Dr. Thornfield. Instead, it shows how ordinary people, by making consistently moral choices in difficult circumstances, can accomplish extraordinary things. As we reach the end of this dark chronicle, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. The story of Princess Isolde of Valdemon, whether historical fact or cautionary fiction, challenges us to examine our own capacity for moral choice and our responsibility to resist evil when we encounter it. The manuscript reminds us that civilization is a fragile construct, maintained not by laws and institutions alone, but by the daily choices of countless individuals to treat one another with dignity and respect. When those choices consistently favor selfishness over service, cruelty over compassion, the results can be catastrophic. But the story also demonstrates that evil, no matter how powerful it may seem, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Isolde's quest for absolute power ultimately left her isolated and powerless, trapped in a hell of her own making. Her father's grand design collapsed because it was built on foundations that could not sustain themselves indefinitely. The resistance that finally brought down their reign succeeded not through superior force or cunning, but through their commitment to values that evil cannot understand or effectively counter. In the end, love proved stronger than hate, truth more enduring than deception, and hope more powerful than despair. Perhaps that is the most important lesson we can draw from this tale of horror and redemption. No matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how overwhelming the forces arrayed against us, the human capacity for good remains unconquerable. It may be driven underground, suppressed, and persecuted, but it never truly dies. And so we close this forbidden chronicle with both warning and hope. Warning about the ease with which evil can take root when we become complacent about the values that define our humanity. But hope that these same values, when courageously defended, possess the power to overcome even the darkest of evils. The story of Valdemon calls us to vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the corrupting influences that can emerge within our own hearts and communities. It reminds us that the price of freedom and human dignity is eternal watchfulness, and that each of us must choose, moment by moment, which values we will serve. In the end, that may be the greatest truth contained within these ancient pages, that we are all authors of our own stories, and the choices we make today will determine what legacy we leave for future generations. Let us choose wisely, for the consequences extend far beyond ourselves to touch all whose lives intersect with our own. The manuscript of Isolde of Valdemon serves as both mirror and warning, reflecting back to us our own capacity for good and evil, while challenging us to choose the light even in the darkest of times. In that choice lies our salvation, and our hope for a future worthy of the sacrifices made by those who came before us. As Brother Thomas wrote in his final entry, "The war against darkness is eternal, but so too is the human spirit's capacity to kindle light in even the deepest shadows." That is our gift, our burden, and our greatest hope. And with those words, we leave the dark kingdom of Valdemon behind, carrying with us the lessons learned from its tragic tale and the determination to ensure that such horrors never again find fertile ground in our world.